At 0200 hours, over the black, freezing airspace above the Sea of Azov, a Russian missile corvette was gliding through the darkness, with no idea that death was already closing in. Its crew believed they were sailing inside a fortress of steel, protected by layers of advanced radar, surface-to-air missiles, and heavy naval guns worth hundreds of millions of dollars. This was a warship built to survive high-end combat, a vessel designed on paper to challenge even the deadliest fleets on Earth. But tonight, all of that power was about to be humiliated by a small group of Ukrainian operators guiding modified fiberglass aircraft that cost less than a second-hand civilian car. And when this attack was over, the corvette would not just be damaged, its own cruise missile arsenal would become useless deadweight, trapped inside launch tubes it could no longer trust. At that moment, Russian radar operators were staring at calm green screens. 30 miles away, 3 Ukrainian Sting drones were racing in at wave-top height, skimming barely 15 feet above the surface of the water. By flying this low, they were exploiting one of the oldest limits in radar physics, the curvature of the Earth itself. The corvette's sensors simply could not see them below the radar horizon. It was the aerodynamic equivalent of sneaking toward a guard tower by crawling through a trench so deep that the sentry never even knows you exist. The Stings were small, fast, and built from materials that barely reflected radar at all. In under 3 minutes, they would go from invisible to unavoidable, and the Russian crew would have absolutely no time to prepare for what was coming. Before we go further, hit like and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you know. The moment the lead Sting crossed the 12-mile mark, the corvette's early warning systems finally caught the faintest whisper of danger. Instantly, the ship shifted from routine patrol posture to full general quarters. Alarms tore through the steel passageways. The Russian commander did not wait for confirmation. He ordered immediate deployment of broad-spectrum electronic warfare, flooding the surrounding airspace with high-powered radio interference. The mission was simple: break the control links between the Ukrainian operators and their drones, blind the attackers, and turn them into falling wreckage before they ever reached the ship. 10 miles behind the fast-moving Sting formation, a heavier Ukrainian bomber drone slammed into that invisible wall of jamming. Inside a distant bunker hundreds of miles away, its operator watched the video feed collapse into violent static before disappearing completely. Telemetry died. Control input vanished. From the Russian perspective, this should have been a clean electronic kill. Their jamming had suffocated the radio link, and under normal circumstances that would have ended the threat immediately. But Ukrainian engineers had prepared for exactly this moment. Instead of tumbling into the sea, the bomber's onboard flight computer instantly recognized the loss of signal and switched smoothly into autonomous navigation mode. Relying on inertial guidance and preloaded satellite waypoints, it continued straight ahead without hesitation. The Russian electronic shield that was meant to destroy the drone had effectively done the opposite. It had placed it on a lethal autopilot. While the heavier bomber pushed forward through the electronic fog on autonomous guidance, the 3 smaller Sting drones drove closer to the coastline, staying low enough to preserve their stealth advantage. Flying at 50 feet over land was an act of controlled madness. Every second demanded perfect reactions to power lines, rooftops, terrain shifts, and elevation changes. But the benefit was extraordinary. Against the clutter of a coastal industrial zone, the Russian shipboard radar could not separate those fiberglass drones from the noise of the ground itself. It was like trying to pick out a single grey moth against a wet concrete wall during a storm. The radar processor simply filtered them away as meaningless background interference. But this low-altitude tactic came with a brutal price. By dropping low enough to stay beneath the engagement envelope of larger surface-to-air missiles, the drones had entered the kill zone of something much simpler and much more primitive: ordinary soldiers with ordinary rifles. As the formation crossed above a coastal shipping yard, a Russian patrol spotted the silhouettes and opened fire with automatic weapons. Tracer rounds ripped through the night. One bullet sliced through the fuel line of the Sting on the right flank. The drone lurched sideways, stalled, and crashed into the roof of a warehouse in a sudden orange fireball. One cheap bullet had erased 1/3 of the strike package. In an instant, the combat power of the attacking formation dropped by 33%. It was a reminder that these systems were not invincible. They were fragile, disposable machines, and now the surviving drones had even less margin for error. The remaining 2 Sting drones dropped another 10 feet, trying to escape the small arms fire, but the destruction of their wingmen had already changed the battlefield. The explosion worked like a flare in the darkness. A previously hidden Russian Pantsir air defense system near the shoreline suddenly came alive, its radar energizing as it locked onto the fight. The Pantsir was a mobile nightmare, armed with twin 30mm autocannons and a full battery of guided missiles engineered specifically to kill fast-moving aerial threats. 4 seconds later, it acquired the lead sting and launched an interceptor. The missile tore forward at more than 2,000 miles per hour, cutting through the darkness with terrifying speed. A conventional pilot would have tried to break away, only to fail against a missile traveling at over 3 times the speed of sound. But the Ukrainian operator did something so aggressive and so counterintuitive that it shattered the Russian firing solution. Knowing the Pantsir's missiles had a minimum arming distance and a tiny delay in how their proximity fuse calculated a lethal detonation window, the pilot shoved the throttle forward and drove the sting directly at the incoming interceptor. The head-on geometry compressed the engagement so violently that the missile and drone crossed each other too quickly for the fuse to trigger properly. The interceptor blasted harmlessly past into empty space. The sting survived by rushing straight through the kill zone before the weapon could actually kill it. A second later, the drone slammed into the Pantsir's radar dish and detonated its shaped charge warhead. The blast transformed the system's multi-million-dollar tracking array into molten wreckage, blinding the entire coastal defense unit in one violent strike. With that shoreline air defense node reduced to a burning crater, the second sting punched through the opening in radar coverage and locked its optical system onto the corvette itself. The Russian warship was still scanning for a completely different kind of threat. Its massive early warning radar expected fast, conventional anti-ship missiles arriving at supersonic speed. Instead, this drone was moving at barely 100 miles per hour and presenting a radar signature no larger than a seagull. On Russian scopes, it merged into the chaos of sea clutter. Hidden among the endless scattering of radar returns bouncing off the waves, the captain ordered chaff launched immediately, firing thousands of aluminum strips into the sky to create a giant metallic decoy cloud that would normally confuse any radar-guided attack. But the Sting was not hunting with radar. Its optical targeting camera simply looked through the cloud and recognized the physical silhouette of the ship the way a phone camera can recognize a face. The chaff achieved nothing. The Ukrainian operator guided the drone straight into the rotating antenna of the corvette's primary search radar. The explosion ripped the sensor array apart in a burst of fire and debris, instantly blinding the warship and collapsing its long-range defensive picture. In one flash, a multi-million-dollar sensor network was gone. The corvette was now fighting blind, forced to depend entirely on short-range automated close-in weapon systems. Those automated turrets spun frantically, their computers trying to solve a firing equation against a target that kept altering its speed and altitude every few seconds. It was like trying to swat a fly with a sniper rifle. In desperation, Russian electronic warfare crews unleashed another wave of interference, flooding every known radio frequency in a last attempt to cut the drones off from their controllers. But these drones had been designed for exactly that environment. Their communications used advanced frequency hopping software, shifting channels hundreds of times every second. The Russian jammers were always a fraction too late, chasing frequencies that no longer existed. The ship's guns erupted, vomiting thousands of rounds of 30mm tungsten ammunition into the night sky. Almost all of it went into empty air, missing the drones as they danced through the tracer fire with horrifying precision. Seeing the automated defenses fail, the Russian captain ordered emergency evasive action and threw the helm hard to starboard. He wanted to reduce the ship's exposure, present a narrower profile, and buy precious seconds by turning away from the attack. But war at sea is ruled by physics, and physics showed no mercy. A heavily armored vessel weighing thousands of tons carries enormous inertia. It cannot pivot like an aircraft. It cannot dodge like a small machine. It takes long, painful minutes for a ship like that to truly alter its path, sliding across the water like a drifting building. The remaining drones, by contrast, weighed less than a person. They could reverse direction in a heartbeat. The agility gap was so extreme that the warship's evasive turn almost looked absurd. Then one of the drones exploited the corvette's weakness with ruthless precision. It dropped lower and lower until it was skimming just 5 feet above the waves. That altitude was not chosen only for stealth. It was a carefully designed geometric trap. The ship's heavy automated cannons could not depress far enough to aim directly downward. Their firing arcs were restricted by safety limits intended to prevent the vessel from shooting its own deck or superstructure. By diving beneath that minimum depression angle, the drone slipped into a mechanical blind spot. A billion-dollar warship had just become helpless against a threat hugging the water beside its hull, because its guns literally could not point low enough to engage it. With the automated turrets effectively neutralized by their own design limitations, the burden of defense fell to terrified sailors. Russian crewmen flooded onto the outer decks, dragging heavy machine guns into position and trying to track the incoming drones through iron sights over a heaving Black Sea. But human reaction time is hopelessly inadequate in that kind of fight. A sailor trying to lead a fast-moving drone across chaotic ocean swells has no real chance to compute the shot properly. They fired hundreds of rounds, but the surviving drones slipped through the gaps in the manual fire as if the bullets were barely there. At that exact moment, the heavier bomber drone reappeared. After surviving the first wave of Russian jamming by shifting into autonomous flight, it emerged through the cloud cover above the battle. Guided by its internal gyroscopes and pre-programmed coordinates, it had reached the engagement zone with chilling precision. While every Russian eye was fixed on the low-level Sting skimming beside the waves, the bomber rolled over into a steep, unpowered dive from 2,000 feet. It became a silent falling bomb carrying more than 40 pounds of explosives aimed directly at the heart of the corvette's communications structure. The Russian crew had lost all situational awareness. They had no idea that the decisive blow was already descending on them from above. The bomber crashed into the ship's central communications mast like a freight train. 40 pounds of explosives detonated instantly. The shockwave shattered reinforced bridge glass. The sheer kinetic violence snapped the steel lattice of the mast, hurling antennas and sensor assemblies down onto the deck. In less than a second, the corvette lost satellite links, encrypted radio channels, and secondary radar systems all at once. The captain was severed from regional naval command, unable to call for support or even describe the disaster unfolding around him. The ship had become a steel box drifting in combat, cut off, deaf, and blind. This was exactly what the Ukrainian operators intended. By sacrificing their heaviest platform to destroy the communications hub, they ensured the corvette could not coordinate with any nearby friendly units. The ship was now isolated in darkness, losing information, losing options, and losing time. The last surviving Sting, still hidden just above the waves inside the blind zone of the defensive guns, instantly registered the explosion above. Its pilot knew the first phase of the attack had succeeded, but the most devastating blow was still ahead. With the Russian command crew stunned and disoriented, the low-flying drone pulled back hard and climbed sharply up the side profile of the warship. Sailors on the weather deck, half deafened by the communications mast explosion and distracted by debris crashing around them, barely even registered the tiny fiberglass aircraft streaking toward the center of the vessel. The drone was not aimed at the bridge. It was not aimed at the engines. Its targeting camera locked onto something even more dangerous: the armored steel canisters housing the corvette's primary offensive missiles. Inside those tubes sat advanced supersonic cruise missiles, each worth millions and each capable of inflicting catastrophic damage on land targets. But in that moment, those same weapons were transformed into liabilities. They were volatile, vulnerable, and packed inside a warship whose fire suppression network had already been disrupted by the destruction overhead. As data cables hung severed and warning lights flashed red across damaged control panels, the Russian engineering crew understood the nightmare all at once. If the drone struck the launch area at close range, there was almost nothing left to stop a catastrophic internal kill. The Sting crossed the last 50 yards in under 2 seconds and smashed straight into the outer armor of the starboard missile launch tubes. On impact, its shaped charge warhead detonated. This was not an ordinary explosive built to scatter fragments in every direction. Inside that warhead was a precision-machined copper cone, and the blast inverted it into a hypervelocity jet of molten metal. That liquid copper lance accelerated to astonishing speed and punched into the launch tube with such concentrated pressure that the armored steel behaved like fluid, flowing apart under the force. In a tiny fraction of a second, the jet bored a perfectly circular hole straight through the protective casing. Years of metallurgy, armor design, and naval engineering were defeated as easily as a hot needle passing through wax. Ukrainian engineers had selected that warhead for one purpose only: not to sink the ship outright, but to penetrate deep enough to destroy it from the inside. What followed was immediate and catastrophic. The shaped charge's superheated fragments severed the hydraulic lines responsible for operating the launch system's blast doors. Pressurized hydraulic fluid sprayed into the confined spaces around the missile silos, atomizing into a fine mist that was as flammable as it was deadly. At the same moment, the shock of the blast tore through nearby electrical conduits, stripping insulation from heavy copper cables and leaving live wires exposed. Sparks erupted against shredded steel bulkheads and instantly ignited the mist. In one violent instant, the corvette stopped fighting an outside attacker and began fighting itself. Its own fluids, wiring, and internal systems were now becoming weapons against it. As that hydraulic fire spread across the deck, the thermal radiation began heating the neighboring cruise missiles, still trapped inside their tubes. Those weapons depended on volatile, solid rocket propellant, chemicals that were safe only as long as heat stayed under control. Under normal circumstances, thermal insulation and internal safety systems protected them. But the shaped charge penetration had compromised the seals, and the growing fire was now cooking the missile casings directly. The Russian engineering officer recognized the danger and ordered a manual flood of the magazine compartments, hoping to drown the missiles in seawater before they could ignite. But the override stations were positioned directly beneath the burning launch tubes. Flames and toxic black smoke made the route impossible. No one could reach them. The crew had no choice but to abandon the compartment, sealing themselves behind watertight doors while the ship's most powerful weapons continued to bake in the inferno.